Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's my pleasure and my honor to introduce tonight's dinner speaker. Adam Bligh is the founder and the CEO of Seed, a media and technology company committed to helping to advance science and its potential to improve the state of the world. By way of a little bit of a biography, Adam began his career at the age of 16 as the youngest researcher at the National Research Council of Canada, where he spent 3 years conducting biomedical research. Following his time in the lab there, Adam set out to launch Seed, a new type of science magazine for our times with the mission of raising scientific literacy. Under Adam's leadership, Seed has received 2 national magazine awards for Best Design and General Excellence, the magazine industry's highest honor. The magazine's mission has since led to the development of new brands, platforms from software to data visualization, and markets from Europe to Brazil. In terms of his other accomplishments, in 2007, Adam was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. He is the recipient of the Golden Jubilee Medal from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and his achievements have been highlighted by the former Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. He has spoken around the world on the future of science and its role in society, most notably to the World Economic Forum at Davos, the STS Forum at Kyoto, the U.S. Department of State at Washington, D.C., and the Royal Society in London, and a number of other fantastic venues, and at universities around the world. He has served on the nominating committees and juries on the Buckminster Fuller Challenge, the Earth Award, the TED Prize, and sits on the Scientific Advisory Council for the World Economic Forum, the American Committee of Israel's Weizmann Institute of Science, the Communications Advisory Board of the United States National Academy of Sciences, and the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Innovation. And Adam was invited here tonight following a presentation that we saw him give. Tony and I actually had the pleasure of seeing him give a similar talk at the International Council on Science and Technological Information in Helsinki, Finland. And it was, I think, a very inspiring talk. I think it has a very important message, and Tony and I thought it would be a fantastic message to share with this crowd tonight. So, with no further ado, Adam Bligh from Seed.
Thank you, Lee. And this is very loud. And to Harold and to Tony and to everyone at Microsoft Research for the invitation, thank you. So I come to this discussion about open science, one that so many of you have much greater experience in than I do. By way, you heard briefly of an early career in science and a first passion that still to today lives in the lab. And as much as today I spend my time thinking about the future of science and talking about it and running a company and creating software and doing things like that, my greatest pleasures still live, thinking about the times at 3 a.m. doing an immunofluorescence, or the feel of a good pipette, or coming into the lab in the morning and smelling agar, and that's where my passion lies. But while I was in my lab, it struck me that this was a passion that was all too rarefied, and one that shouldn't be so rare. And in fact, as the world becomes increasingly driven by science, and as we recognize today, certainly those of us in this room don't need convincing, but those of us who aren't in the room are increasingly recognizing that science is the engine of the world economy. It's increasingly the subject of political debates around the world. It's the subject of referendums and elections. And its relationship to the rest of society is richer and richer. whether in terms of arts or design, religion, humanities, across the spectrum of society. And I've argued, and it's without question a driving thesis for me in all of the work we do today, even in our software and our technology and the things that I'll show you, that we're on the cusp of this great scientific renaissance, our own renaissance for these times. And it'll be very different than the renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries. But some things will be similar. The relationship between science and design, which I think is a new interaction and a new relationship that I'm going to show you some work that we just launched last week. That's the result of many years of trying to bridge our community with the design community. And some other things that I'll share with you. But that's the genesis for a lot of our thinking. So from a past few years that's been spent thinking about how to communicate science better and look at the state of science communication, how we take the outstanding research being done by many of you in the room tonight and communicate it to millions who aren't literate in science, and evolve from the days of science magazines of the past and brands of the past and try to modernize them with new media and new approaches, to really thinking about how do we take this movement of open science, which is so fundamental to the future, not just of science, but of society, and I want to make that case, and how do we make it real? How do we evolve it from being a movement, from being something that's grassroots and nascent, to truly being the defining attribute of science in the 21st century? So I want to start with this thesis. I want to make this statement and kind of build it up a little bit, and then give you some examples of why I believe it's true, and how we are attempting to contribute in small ways to advancing this mission. So I think that the future of science is open, but I want to make the case that not because it should be, although of course it should be. Of course it ought to be. Of course we should acknowledge that the knowledge that we are accumulating about the world that's being funded by the world should belong to the world. No question of that. And I think that this must be sort of the driving force of an open science movement. And it's a cause that many people can rally behind. It's a cause that should be the defining attribute. But it's ultimately not enough to make this sustainable. Because at the end of the day, science is also a business. Science is also a source of jobs. It's also an industry. And we need to be mindful of that, and that's okay. So how do we make it truly sustainable and truly scalable? But first and foremost, being driven by this movement and this mission. The other reason why it ought to be, why it should be open, is because the pursuit of scientific literacy today, something that in the times of Sputnik we viewed in a very symmetric fashion with the rest of the world. And so the goal was, we could say, one new scientist in the United States and one new scientist in the Soviet Union would sort of be able to be calibrated, and we could just pursue the goal of more scientists and this kind of quantitative goal. And we had very simple metrics for determining the scientific literacy of a society. It meant, how many scientists are we producing? But today, clearly, that notion has fallen apart, and as the world has become more asymmetric, we can't simply view the metric for scientific literacy, for math and science education, as being how many scientists does one country have versus another country. So the quest for scientific literacy today, which I think in these times when science is so fantastically linked to every issue on the global agenda, of course, from climate change to global health and so forth, all the ones that we're familiar with, how do we engage the public in the scientific method in a more organic way? And part of it is by making science more participatory. It's through the movement of citizen science and movements that have spawned from it. and initiatives like BioBricks and others. And so the opening up of science enables the greater participation in science, which allows us all to become more literate in the methodologies of science. And this is an important shift, because when you think about this, 50 years ago, this wasn't quite the goal. This wasn't quite how we viewed math and science education. And so today, as we want to make that methodology more pervasive, more universal, we want the capacity to think scientifically to become a universal attribute. We want scientific literacy to be something that's not about simply an incremental addition of one more scientist, but truly 7 billion people around the world who are capable of thinking scientifically. Then we need for science to be open in order for others to participate in it. So not because it should be, but because it needs to be. Because the essence of science today and the direction of it and where things are trending requires it to be open. So some of these trends are very familiar to those of you in the room. They're the subject of workshops over the last day and will be over the coming hours and days. But I want to sort of highlight a couple of them because they build the case for why openness is needed and not simply something that is a luxury. For those of you who have had the awesome pleasure of going to Geneva and visiting the Large Hadron Collider, as I've had over the last few years, a handful of times, and the most awesome part about being at LHC, certainly we could talk about the advent of LHC's grid and all of the innovations that come from it. But the frontier of science today, the other thing that LHC represents, is embodied in the cafeteria, is embodied in the number of scientists coming from the number of countries that are represented in that cafeteria in Geneva, and the number of disciplines that are represented there. And as science necessarily, as big science necessarily requires the investment at this order of magnitude of billions of dollars of capital, it necessarily requires the collaboration of nations. It necessarily requires a new level of interaction that requires a new type of infrastructure. It's interesting that, we think about projects like the LHC, these big, massive science projects, oftentimes as being kind of a luxury. I remember one of the first times I was at LHC, I was talking to some of the scientists, and one of the questions that came up is, so, why did you build this, basically? And, why does it take so much? Why is it such a massive project that costs so much money? And the scientists obviously are answering that, if we could have found a simpler solution, if we could have found a less expensive solution, of course we'd go there. But this is what's required in order to simply advance the science. So if we want to understand this, this is the solution that we require, and these are the resources that are required in order to achieve that goal. This is required for the frontier of science. Certainly, as we think about the advent of data-intensive science, we need new languages, and I want to share with you some of our own work in data visualization. We need new languages in order to be able to make sense of it. And the creation of new languages, new common languages, as ubiquitous as the pie chart, requires that we have the ability to interact across disciplines and across sectors of society, from education to science to design to other areas of society, in order to introduce something as fundamental as a new language. Because this will require broad societal participation. And so this kind of a movement requires the openness of data, the openness of discussion around the data, in order to introduce new language to be able to understand it. C.S. Kiang from Peking University said this in SEED a couple of years ago: complexity is the new science. Everything is complex. Every problem in the world is a system. The disciplines are classified by people, but nature never recognizes them. And I think that's just an awesome way of putting it. And distinctly un-Western, frankly. And so as we see the rise of science outside of the West, and we see a more holistic approach to problem solving that took the West a shift in order to get to, but is endogenous to a lot of thinking outside of Western science, complexity requires that we bridge divides between disciplines. We recognize this certainly as scientists, but when you look at it up close, and some of you may have seen this map before from Brad Paley and his colleagues, and you map 800,000 scientific papers into 776 paradigms, organized by linkages by author. And you start seeing where the bridges are actually being formed at the frontier between brain research and math and computer science and brain research and so on and so forth. You recognize that the need today is for openness between the disciplines. So here too, this is not simply because we want this to happen. This is not just a sort of new trend that will lead to sort of new funding in universities and new books, and this is simply where the direction of research is heading. And this direction, this state of science, requires openness between disciplines. This is some data from our own State of Science report. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but I'll read it to you. So 65% of scientists that we polled, this was a global survey, cite literature as having an influence on their science. We asked them about art, about current affairs. How does the world around you impact the way you think about problems when you come into the lab in the morning? And we have this view that science is a closed system. But in fact, as those of us who are in science recognize, ideas can come from anywhere. And oftentimes they do. And so to the extent that we open up science, not only to the disciplines within science, but to disciplines outside of the traditional sciences, there too we're able to forge new inspirations and new ideas. 62% of scientists are involved in at least one international collaboration. And I think as we recognize that scientists care more and more, we have this sense that scientists, by and large, are not people who care about issues in the world, that they're focused on their research, when in fact scientists are people and live in the world and are citizens and they vote and they care about all things around them. As we recognize science to be a truly socially responsible discipline, and scientists as practitioners care about the social impact of their research, we want to better connect the needs of society with the ability of science to solve problems and contribute to the solving of problems. And so there too, we need the open systems that allow scientists to connect with the NGOs, with the end users of their science, with the end users of their applications, in order to ensure that the capacity of science is best leveraged towards social causes around the world. So as we move towards an open science paradigm, not because of desire, but because of need, we need to think about the business models that have historically buttressed science and from which many companies derive substantial profits, and in fact the web itself that was created to advance this mission, but that today isn't ultimately serving it. Today, the research web is disorganized, it's fragmented, and it's inefficient. Like universities. Information today remains structured around disciplines, and this is for good reason. Today, we are making policy decisions and funding decisions based on lagging indicators. Lagging indicators that for too long have dominated science and from which we can't ultimately revolutionize science, because these indicators, these metrics, are so important to all of us, but they must be overturned. And ultimately, innovations are being driven to preserve business models and not improve research. And an industry that's designed to serve you has ultimately been caught up with preserving a business model of how scientific information is disseminated and stored, and not ultimately with the focus of improving research. Today, we have an opportunity to change this because technology is enabling it, regulation is changing, and more than anything else, scientists themselves are at the frontier of this revolution. So I want to make this case that scientists need better, they deserve better, society needs better. This is too important to not revolutionize. And it's too fundamental a transformation to simply be happening incrementally. This requires wholesale revolution because we're talking about the future of knowledge. We're talking about information that has the potential, as we recognize, once it's unlocked, to have such fantastic social impact that this is too important a cause to not revolutionize outright. And so scientists aren't waiting. I remember being in my lab, and I think this is sort of one of the real memories I take away from being in a lab, is you would get this, magnificent new piece of equipment, and an awesome company had spent years of R&D tinkering with this, and then it just needed like a little bit of Scotch tape, right? Like just one extra paper clip, a little bit of aluminum foil, just to optimize the instrument just a little bit, because it wasn't quite right. And scientists aren't waiting for the upgrade to that system, right? They're hacking away and finding solutions because it's endogenous to the culture of science to simply go after the solution, to go after the truth and find a solution. It's not about waiting for industry. It's not about waiting for trusted brands. It's about simply pursuing it. And so today, what we're seeing, and what we certainly see here, is the diversity of solutions that's being introduced to solve a problem that we all recognize is there, but is being tackled piecemeal. And that's sort of a natural approach because science doesn't have any leadership. Science doesn't say we're going to go this way, right? There's no organization that says this month here, next quarter here. And because there's no mechanism of enforced top-down consensus building, it's very difficult to achieve this kind of revolution. And so we see things bottom up, and yet at the same time today, this is too important a revolution to not ultimately aggregate some of these evolutions into one wholesale top-down revolution. Because also things like metrics, things like a digital core, things like evolving common standards and indicators require some consensus to be achieved across the scientific community. So how do we re-architect science effectively for the 21st century? And make sure that open science is scalable, it's sustainable, and it's simple. And it's ultimately something that all researchers can immediately tap into. And there is no activation energy that's required in another generation that's required for this to become common in all labs around the world. So I want to offer 5 pillars that I think are required, are the prerequisites for making open science real. The first is a digital core. And what I mean by that is that we simply can't assume that the evolution from an analog system of science, of papers, to a digital science can simply be achieved by digitizing the analog instruments that we had. That simply doesn't work. And ultimately, we will be retrofitting from here until infinity unless we make the decision to introduce a digital core to science. What that means, and whether that takes the shape of cyber infrastructure, and yet I think that the direction of much of the discussion about cyber infrastructure has more to do with the data dimension, the storage capabilities, the cloud, and so forth, and less to do with what's in front of the scientist. I think we need to recognize that without a truly digital core, where everything interacts with each other, then we're simply adding Band-Aids to the solution. We need mandated free flow of information. This shouldn't be a question. This should be a decision by all governments around the world that fund science, that all information that's funded by government is immediately available to the public. This should not even be a question. Publishing companies that make profits and that need to be protected should simply evolve or die. Because that's not our problem. Government should fund peer review, is my view. Peer review matters. It's fundamental. I don't think it's changing. I think it's too essential to the future of science to open or closed. And so the argument that this is an expensive process, so is science. The world spends $1 trillion each year in R&D. I think we can allocate some funding to peer review. And if we can make peer review something that happens out in the open, that is truly digital, that is funded by government, well then the business models that we're concerned about suddenly start to change because the cost structures change. So I think there's no reason why the free flow of scientific information shouldn't be government mandated right away. We need open standards. And there's some amazing projects being evolved to create these kinds of standards, and whether it's about authors, about data, about rights to distribute data, certainly this is a whole topic and a whole conference unto itself. An amazing area and some amazing people doing some amazing work here. But we also need to make sure that there's interoperability across these standards. We need to make sure, as we, for example, are working with Crossref and working with Archive and working with all different institutions, we need to make sure that there's interoperability across new standards that we're introducing for open science. And again, because there is no world body of research, there is no UN body that's just going to say, here it is, and we have to achieve some form of consensus, I think this is a little bit of a challenge, because we do have players that have vested interests in ensuring that change doesn't happen. And so this is a challenge. This one is probably something that startups can't fix, technology companies can't fix, scientists can't fix. This requires a little bit of thinking and strategy. The fourth is we need a language to extract knowledge from information. This is, to me, just a pretty way of saying we need data visualization. We need data visualization to become something that isn't simply the domain of science and computer science, but is a truly populist language. And I want to share with you some work we're doing in that domain, because we need to all be able to access this data. Now, some of the data that's being made available by science is necessarily esoteric and must be so. And so the public's ability, or perhaps even other domains' ability, other disciplines' ability to interact or understand or visualize it may not be so important. But there's too much data from too many areas that is important to other disciplines that we do need to think about this in a truly universal way. Because if NIH is going to now start talking more and more to physicists about cancer, well, then we need new ways of exposing that data and ensuring that we can visually represent it. And so this is something I want to talk a little bit more about. And finally, we need modern metrics. Here, too, it strikes me as ludicrous that one company controls so much information and so much about the direction and future of science. And this just strikes me as something that should be changed. Modern metrics that aren't based on lagging indicators of the direction of science, that aren't based on the journal, that are based on the article and maybe even more, and indicators that we can tap into dynamically, that we can immediately assess the momentum of science immediately, today. Because as this is the trend that we're seeing in other domains, there's no reason that science, moving as fast as science does, shouldn't have the most dynamic indicators of where it is for us all to tap into. So this is my conviction. These 5 things are the pillars of making open science scalable, sustainable, and simple. So I want to share 2 areas of current work that we're doing, knowledge from information and modern metrics. Digital core is another area that we've been conducting research in. but today I want to talk about the bottom two. So we tackle problems either through digital media or through software. And I want to tackle one and share one with you that's through the lens of software, and another that's where we thought the solution isn't quite software, it's digital media. So the first is metrics. And for us, the challenge was, how do we create new maps, create new platforms from these first principles, so that then we can use new approaches to information visualization and collection to give us new metrics. So instead of saying, this is our current set of data, and we're going to apply new ways of visualizing or quantifying it, as others are doing, and I think there's amazing work being done there, we're saying, can we also create platforms that produce data that we can then apply new approaches to data collection and visualization in order to yield new metrics? And so research blogging is an example of that. This is a project that we launched not too long ago in order to recognize that today much of the conversation that's happening upon publication of a paper is happening online. And as this journal club effectively has gone digital and is increasingly digital, a lot of the conversation gets lost and is frankly unsearchable. And so as a scientist, if you're writing something on your blog, on a notebook, about a paper, we want to make sure that, first of all, this information is directed to other researchers who might be interested in the collective views of the community about that particular paper. And so what we're doing is providing scientists with tools to be able to tag posts on blogs that they're writing with the capabilities needed to organize that information in a sort of post-publication peer review. We want to be able to allow all this conversation to be able to be fed back to researchers so that you can now understand this is what the community is saying about this particular paper, about this particular keyword, about this particular author, and be able to track the conversation dynamically. We're feeding that to journals so that journals can be able to showcase the conversation alongside the original paper, because our view is that conversations should be just happening organically. Scientists shouldn't have another website that they have to go to, another social network, another place, another destination that a media company's created. They should just do what they want to do, because you frankly don't have more time in the day to use new social gadgets and widgets and all these sorts of things. You should just be doing what you're doing, and we should adapt the technology in order to meet the behaviors of scientists today. And so we want to make sure that the conversations that are happening around the web are ultimately figuring around the original paper. And then finally, we want to make sure that we can quantify this. So this is the first paper that's been published by Paul Groth and his team, called Studying Scientific Discourse on the Web Using Bibliometrics. And this is the beginning of research that we're doing to better understand and quantify the relationship between conversations happening across the social web and the ultimate impact factor, traditional impact factors of that paper. So can we start to develop more immediate senses by looking at the discussion happening online of the direction of science? The second area that we're working on in research is data visualization. I mentioned earlier this notion of a new language, and that's kind of how we view this. So in every era that requires a new language, either because of the complexity of the information of the time, the volume of information of the time, new approaches to information communication arise, and typically this is where we see the harmonization of science and design. In 1801, it was a Scottish engineer named William Playfair who was trying to demonstrate visually the distribution of the Ottoman Empire. And he introduced the pie chart. And today, of course, this is a universal representation of information. Kindergarten kids can look at this and understand the relationship between these different elements. Today, the data moment that we're living in is not simply one that resides within research. It's across society. And the literacy that's required is not simply specific to science, it's required across society. And so this new language of data visualization is emerging with new tools that are increasingly easy to use and democratized. And so now as the software is evolving, and it's very easy to quickly visualize information, we think that the next wave is how do we bring in other communities that either need to contribute data and be engaged in producing data, offering up data for our analysis, for our consideration, or to be able to use visualizations so that we collectively advance our literacy when it comes to the communication of complex relationships or large data sets. So our approach here has been a new platform that we just launched 10 days or so ago called visualizing.org in partnership with GE. And visualizing.org leverages the power of social media to make finding, spreading data and data visualizations about world issues very easy and fast, so that as issues occur, as oil spills occur, as OECD reports on obesity, as the UN High Commission reports on the state of refugees in the world, we can immediately couple data, but more importantly, crowdsourced data visualization under a Creative Commons license to be able to be rapidly distributed using the power of the social web. So in the last 10 days of this experiment, what's been most exciting has been not just the data part of this, which is very interesting, and the search capabilities that we've developed to look for data about cancer in China in the 1980s from public domain sources, and to allow for data to be deposited here under various licenses. But the way in which the discussion, which is very important to us, the discussion about issues is shifting. And when we can track across Twitter the conversation about obesity or the conversation about human migration on the heels of a report that's released that starts to include data and data visualization, that becomes very interesting. And that's our goal. The other dimension of this platform that we think we're trying to introduce, and this platform is free, under CC, entirely open to use, is collaborative peer review. Because today we don't really have a sense of whether a visualization is good, whether it actually helps us understand something or not, and how it can be improved. And so first of all, we'll tackle it with rights, so that all the visualizations that this community is uploading, and we've created partnerships with 25 or so design schools around the world to bring in the design community to help the science community communicate information. Design has always been our partner. Design is what creates interfaces to allow us, first of all, to interact with our own data, but also to allow the public to interact with the revolutions that science is spawning. And so once again, by forming this partnership with design, we're starting to enable the public to upload visualizations, to collaborate on peer review so that we can assess whether the visualizations are good, whether they're contributing knowledge, and because it allows for derivative works to be produced, to actually just create derivative works, to actually just advance and move forward and iterate and advance the field through derivative works. So this is kind of the picture. We want to kind of close the circle between the sources of data, and we're working with government agencies and NGOs and all sorts of places where we're trying to encourage them to release new data to the public on visualizing, and we're going to be announcing some cool things in the next few days, with designers and design schools, with the social web, and of course with the general public. So I want to kind of leave with this. How will we know that we're moving in the right direction? as scientists, we want to look for some indicators that give us a sense of whether the system is moving in the right direction, and this is what I would be looking for. I was at a conference many months ago, and Walt Mossberg from the Wall Street Journal was asked to comment on the sort of the state of the web, big picture. And he said, the web, the internet, will reach its true potential when we stop talking about it. Right? When we stop talking about it as something, but it is just like energy, right? It's just the lights are on. It's not a thing. So that's the analog for me. We'll stop using the word open. We won't be talking about open access anymore. We won't be talking about open science. We'll start using the word open less. So if we could visualize the number of times open is used in these meetings over the next few years, we'll have a sense if we're moving in the right direction. And big picture, research is better. It's benefiting from collaboration from outside endogenous domains and disciplines. It's translated faster from lab to society. That should be an output of this revolution. And we should see a rise in scientific literacy across society. As science becomes more open, as scientists have a greater sense of engagement with the public and with other disciplines, and as the public has the capacity to understand science either through visualization, through interaction with open science, we will see a rise in scientific literacy across society in ways that are unique to these times and not to the times of Sputnik. Thank you.
Is it on now? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for a thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion there. I would like to open it up to the audience. I think we have 10 or 15 minutes for some questions. So if anyone has questions for Adam. I saw a hand here first.
Thanks. Great talk. Mark Abbott from Oregon State University. Question, there's a change required in the science culture, which is called the least publishable unit, which I'm curious, when you measure impact, if people are publishing on the order of 1.5 million papers per year of roughly 10,000 words, how do we get the science community, particularly the promotion tenure process, to move towards different metrics of impact? Because it seems to me that's almost essential. I worry about the model you put forward, how you scale up to accommodate that, and I would argue we really need to dig deep into our soul to look at a different way of measuring what the impact of our individual research is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that citations will continue to be important for the foreseeable future. And I don't think that science would ever drop one metric and replace it with another metric as a dominant metric. I think that's an evolution, not a revolution that will ever happen. And so I think for the foreseeable future, we need to be introducing new metrics into the equation that ultimately are being driven by technology and by our movement towards using more technology as part of our process of doing science, our natural behaviors of doing science, and simply allow that behavior to result in new data. It's not about compelling new data, right? It's simply about understanding that this data is being produced and we need to use that data. So that's the first point I would make, is that this isn't about artificially adding a behavior. So that's number one. That's how it scales, because it's the trend. And then we're just capturing data. The second is absolutely, to your kind of preamble, is more cultural. And I think that the way we affect the culture is both through sort of a bottom-up approach, where we're seeing young scientists basically say, I'm going to choose to publish here, or I'm going to make a decision that I'm actually going to allocate some amount of my time, which would traditionally be used for, traditionally advancing my career by spending more time in the lab and publishing another paper. I'm going to go actually write a blog. I'm going to go actually write a book. I'm going to be involved in public engagement in science. And I'm going to take the chance, because I just think that if enough of my peers believe that, then that's where we're going to go, and I'm going to be ultimately rewarded for doing so. The top-down kind of complement to that is the money. So we just need to follow the money. That's it, right? If the people with the money say that's important, lo and behold, it's important. So there is some, right? There's a little bit of a half-truth to what I said earlier, that there isn't quite leadership, and there isn't quite leadership, right? But if Wellcome says this, and Gates says this, and NSF say this all together, well, we would all kind of move in a certain direction. So I think the money is really important, and the people with the money, especially the private foundations, especially the Gates and who are doing sort of amazing work, to push these new requirements.
A question over here.
It's on. I love the vision of what you're thinking about, but I have some real worries about the nature of trying to achieve it. And I think it's got three components that I worry about, and perhaps it's unfair to mention all three and ask you to handle all three. So just pick one if you want. The first one is human nature. We are essentially here as dominant species because we're very good at collaborating, but in scales that are kind of comparable with the hunting unit. And I think that the ability to share intimately and keep to a group some information is a key mechanism in coordinating people making that extra effort facing the lion. I think for at least 3,000 years, philosophers have been trying to find a common language for representing knowledge as we derive it from information, and I think they've seriously failed. So you seem to have a vision of being seriously better than the philosophers. And my third worry is the vulnerability of your model to the global organizations. I won't name names, but there are certain organizations which drive the media, which manipulate the public, which would then damage the science. So I'm not sure
Sorry?
how you... Certainly I see, and I've seen it, for example, in the US when people were discussing healthcare, but I've seen it in the UK over other things, that some of the global press organizations, which also drive television and other mechanisms, communicate with people to the extent which they seriously manipulate the judgment of the people that you want to engage. And if they decide that, for example, some part of science is a bad thing, they will manipulate against it.
Yep. Okay. So I think those are, first of all, I would accept those as three challenges to this vision. And I'll happily tackle two and pick it up over a drink later. The first is, so I'll start with the second. I think the craft of philosophy is inadequate to this challenge, and the craft of design is. That's my hypothesis. I wouldn't leave it to the philosophers to produce this common language or identify it. I think this requires the methodologies and craft of design, which we, for a very long time, have viewed as a less than component of sort of academia or scholarly society. And I think that right now we're seeing a rise in the capacity of design and of designers to interact with other domains and become the real conduits for information and problem solvers. So one is, I tackle that point, and it's an intellectual argument, but I would tackle it with my faith in design over philosophy. To the point about, sorry? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the Da Vinci's of this time are actually living in the domain and the Venn diagram of science and design, and not quite science and art. So anyway, that's kind of my conviction. To the point about kind of big media corrupting scientific literacy, so the way you address that is by enabling the public to become more capable of questioning information that they're being given. To me, scientific literacy is a bankrupt enterprise because for too long it's been motivated by the metric of, can you pass this test, which says Earth revolves around this or this revolves around that type information. And then we associate that knowledge, that information, with the ability to progress in a scientific career, and we make that association. And we've oriented math and science education, at least in this country, towards a goal that's anachronistic with the needs of society today. And so to the extent that now this is big picture and 30,000 feet, but over 10 years, over 20 years, over 30 years, and this is happening, right? I mean, Obama has made speeches about this, and his administration are making extraordinary efforts to make this a reality. So this isn't just vision. They're making it happen. It's by changing the public's view of scientific literacy and our own pursuit of scientific literacy from being something that's knowledge-based, pedantic sort of information to being about the methodology, to being permanently inquisitive and questioning of dogma and unaccepting of information that's just given to you from above. And I think that to the extent we can all be scientists, because we once were all scientists, and we once did all have that capacity to look at something and just keep asking why 14 times over and do a little experiment and take a little bit of that water and see if it's blue everywhere. Because that's just the way that we are by nature. And then we somehow change science education to be something completely different. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, I think, that it's about changing what we are aspiring to in terms of scientific literacy and changing the metrics. But thank you, and I would love to tackle the first one with you as well.
A question here.
Yeah.
Hi, MC from the University of Southampton in the UK. Don't let the accent fool you. The two things, really exciting to look at visualization.org, because working with a group that is trying to handle a lot of open data, just trying to see what's inside a data package on data.gov or data.gov UK is really intractable, especially for a citizen, never mind a citizen wannabe scientist. And trying to put two of those sources together, if you haven't prefabbed them, is really hugely difficult. So I'm really looking forward to that. Secondly, I love research blogging. I had no idea that, wow, this is the research blogging guy. That's fantastic, because it does enable me not only to talk about papers, ideas, and try to translate that a bit into common language and get some feedback from people who might be affected by this, but also to discover things that I just wouldn't discover looking through PubMed. Which brings me to the question of how is progress going in terms of, say, seeing that wonderful research blogging icon appearing in Science Daily or in PubMed itself, or for that matter, Google Scholar or on Bing. Anytime an article is discussed, I'd like to be able to see there where the research blogging discussion is happening too. So,
well, first, thank you. And let me also give credit to one of my colleagues, Dave Munger, who's the visionary behind research blogging. Research blogging has taken off, and we're really excited with the response from the community over the last year. All the things we look to of how many scientists are using it, how many posts are being tagged with research blogging are growing by triple digits over the last year. We're now looking at 2,500 journals in our database, over 15,000 articles, thousands of scientists. So starting to achieve the kind of critical mass that allows us to now have the wherewithal and sort of platform to go to those places that you talked about, the sort of institutions as they were, and offer up the data that's coming from our tools. So we're in partnership mode right now, and we'd love to talk to anybody who would like to use it. And it's completely open, so the APIs are widely available, and we're working with publishers, but certainly beginning some discussions with other knowledge providers, search and stuff like that. So we're open, the APIs are available, and we're doing it. But thank you. Yeah.
Hi, this is Jake Chen from Indiana University. Thank you for the very inspirational talk. And I want to bring up the issue of the second pillar that you mentioned. I think it's quite debatable. And in the second pillar, you mentioned to mandate the free flow of information between laboratory. And my personal experience, I think that...
Sorry, let me just make sure I'm clear on what I'm saying, because I would agree with you. I'm saying that by mandated free flow of information, I mean that information that ultimately is coming about from or in tandem with the publication of a paper that's being funded by the world should be made available immediately to the world. Just so I'm clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I was going to make a comment. First is that there's a certain sense of privacy towards scientists like myself when I'm not ready to actually share it. Even I may actually do work, break it up into 10 series of publications. I may not actually want to share the result in the first publications. And we've got the story, everyone remembered that Watson then discovered the DNA structure. Actually, he took it from the Rosalind's lab, and he got the Nobel Prize. And of course, those who shared it may not always get the credit. So I think the nature of science is always a balance between openness and a certain degree of privacy. That's a comment I want to make. It's not everyone, in every situation, the science always needs to be open. And second is, I question the economy of this. We're living in a resource resource poor environment for science today. And when you look at the NIH funding threshold for many of the excellent projects, it's in a very low double digit, maybe in the 12% or so on. So many projects that are funded, even by our government, are cut to the point that we only have enough to do the science itself. It's not that the scientists didn't want to actually get the result out, but the transformation of the data from one format to a format that is suitable for other machines to automatically communicate, like the one you show on the web, take tremendous effort. Just the freedom of saying that to share this information doesn't mean that this information will actually automatically get out there. There has to be systematic effort in funding the interface so that people like you can actually use.
Two excellent points. I mean, the first I wouldn't challenge at all. I don't think that openness is about or stands in opposition to competition. Competition is important, and it's maybe not a co-equal tenet, but it's an important tenet of science as well. And competition does breed innovation in science. And so openness begins upon publication in this case, or upon some declaration of result in some form, in my own view of openness. So I wouldn't in any way corrupt that pre-publication zone where you may choose to be more competitive. Collaboration should be adopted as a culture because it advances knowledge, not simply because it's good, because then it's not sustainable. So that's an important distinction, and I wouldn't challenge your thesis there. To the second point, there's two ways of tackling this, and I'm not sure which one is right. One is we can simply say, well, our priorities are different today, and as a society, as a community, we are going to allow our funders to simply say, we want to carve out some extra amount for these types of programs, openness programs. And that shouldn't be something that they mandate. That should be something that we say we want, right? So that's one approach, is simply to say we're going to carve out 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever order of magnitude, because we collectively think this is a net positive that is far greater over time than that 1%, 2% this year, next year, or for the next 5 years. It's a big, macroeconomic kind of consideration for the funding of science, but it's a big decision and it's one worth considering from that angle. The other is, this is not just for the advancement of science, but it's for the advancement of our ability to solve global issues. And so to the extent that the scientific community is manifested as more and more socially engaged and responsible, which in the common view, science isn't the most socially responsible and socially engaged enterprise, and there's good reasons for that. There's good reasons for it to be inward-looking and focused on results and not necessarily focused on world issues and being spokespeople for climate change. There's very good reasons for that. But to the extent that science, to some extent, becomes more and more engaged in public discourse, and scientists become more and more engaged in these enterprises, and we start recognizing that scientists start winning more, another Nobel Peace Prize, then we start seeing that science is more and more linked to global issues and to problem solving. It's employed by the president in speeches about solving world problems. Well, then there's new budgets that science should be able to tap into that aren't being, it's not about a zero-sum game between cancer research and more data sharing. It's about science getting additional resources to solve global problems through openness, because we start turning to science more than we start turning to other domains that's at the availability of government. So, if the Pentagon starts saying that climate change is a real present threat to national security, but they can't solve that problem themselves so much, but we want to turn to science, well, then we should maybe start taking budgets from elsewhere, because science is the source of solutions. That's my kind of big picture view. But then it's just about reappropriating all the capital, not just the science capital.
A question here, and this will be the second to last question.
Okay.
We need to be conscious that Adam actually needs to race to the airport and catch a plane this evening.
Shuichi Wata from University of Tokyo. I'm very happy, not only due to the excellent dinner, but also due to excellent your talk.
Thank you.
And I'm completely sharing your opinion and dreams. And it requires a huge perseverant efforts and also continuous efforts. And there are many barriers, and money and selfishness of scientists. But I'm very happy that we have young readers like you. And from your viewpoint, what is the biggest barrier to realize open access, except for money and selfishness of scientists? I think one of the things is how to create the new rule of games for scientists and society. And please declare your agenda as a leader of youngs.
Thank you. Well, I think that the biggest obstacle is not endogenous to science. I think that we're simply responding to behavioral shifts in science, as I mentioned earlier. So I don't think we're trying to add something exogenously to the system here. We're simply responding to it. So I don't think it's in science. And I actually don't think money is such a big problem here, because the resources exist in the system. And as I was mentioning earlier, I think there are more resources that governments around the world will be more and more receptive to tapping into the more we communicate science as an enabler of social change. We haven't done a really good job of doing that for the last couple of decades. So I think that the real obstacle, frankly, are a handful of companies that stand in the way of that change. But you know what? That's what startups are for. And that's what innovation is for, and that's what markets are for, and People make choices about things. But all the things that are standing in our way right now are rooted in simply, a handful of companies. That's it. So we need to just overturn those models. That's it. And that's what you just wake up in the morning and us and handfuls of other companies are thinking about. And it takes just a sort of entrepreneurial spirit to simply say, well, they're multi-billion-dollar companies, but we have a way better idea.
George Rogowski from Caltech. You paint a wonderful, I think, fundamentally correct picture of what future ought to be. And indeed, I think the academia is probably our greatest depository of talent and indeed motivation to produce scientific progress and educate people and so on. But I wonder whether or not academia, or scientists, are agent capable of doing so in 21st century. And the reason for this is that characteristic evolutionary timescale of academia as a social institution are measured in decades or centuries, whereas the fundamental transformative technologies that we're talking about here evolve on scale of years. And academic systems are too wedded to the traditional silos and stovepipes, and it's very difficult to break out of them. The reward systems, the recognition systems, promotion systems are all set in the traditional view, which pretty much was frozen in 19th century, and clearly will not work in 21st. So whereas the talent is there and the goodwill is there, academia as a social institution may be simply structurally incapable of serving its part of the social contract in the 21st century. What do you think should replace it?
This is the sort of cheap answer, and then I'll give you the bigger answer. I mean, the cheap answer is that, I hear people say that. So you're, at Caltech, you're in academia, but you're here, right, from academia, talking about these changes, going back to your universities and adopting them and making them happen. And I think sometimes people from academia stand up at things like this and say, but academia. But you're in academia, and you're here, and you're doing it. And so I somehow think that we have this... Sorry? You are, but that's... You know what? You're at the leading edge of it, and... and you're all awesome. You're at the leading edge of it, and I think that these revolutions are not so anathema to academia. So that's my very optimistic blue sky view of the world. My maybe more practical sense is this. The problems that we face today require this. So that's number one. It's not that we can understand the world around us any other way. So if academia is about understanding the world's issues and understanding the world, then this is just the way we're going to go. It's not that this is a big, trendy revolution of sorts. This is just understanding things differently. This is about recognizing that if you're Columbia and you want to understand the Earth, you create an Earth Institute today. If you're in Stockholm and you want to understand resilience, you create a resilience center and then you organize disciplines around it. If you're at MIT and you want to build new solutions for energy, then you get the leadership and the money around it and you build interdisciplinary faculties around it. So I think that, number one, the issues are just there, and we will, as academia, move in the direction of just where the issues are and what we need to organize around to understand it. Princeton took a floor of its famed physics building and knocked it out and built an institute for theoretical science on the premise that we just can't go as far as we might want as a single discipline. This is a pretty important building with some pretty big egos who've done some pretty amazing work, but they knocked out a floor. The other dimension I keep coming back to is money, right? If money moves it that way, well then things will move faster. Money will be a catalyst. Technology is here the enabler. It's going to not inhibit these changes. It's going to make these changes so simple to adopt because anybody can set up a blog. Anybody can collaborate, and anybody can present data and expose data and visualize. These are just easy, cheap, free, democratic, open tools. So the technology is there. Now if the money leads us there, if the funders of science simply say, if you want $1 billion available to study this, it's over here. Now, we as a society have to ensure that the appropriation of those funds don't overturn kind of decades of cumulative knowledge about theoretical science, for example, and make sure that not everything is in the direction of world issue, put billion, organize around it, because not only do we all recognize that basic research has a value unto itself, but also that we want to remind funders that part of the importance of science, as Robert Wilson said when he was testifying before Congress for the accelerator, is just for the sake of discovery. It's not to make the nation stronger, it's to make the nation worth defending. And so some of research will continue to need to be just completely because it's in the best interest of society at large. So I think that the money will move in the direction that we need it to move. I think that the funders are already moving in that direction, and I feel optimistic that we also, in this country at least, and in many countries around the world that are, in this case, actually finally following American leadership. American leadership is back in science in many respects. And I think we have a president who believes fundamentally in the good of science, in the importance of science, and in the power of science to influence decision-making across society. So I think all of the right factors are in place right now, and I just don't believe that this is a 50-year kind of evolution. I believe that academia is craving for this. And I believe that a lot of disciplines are actually craving to engage with science. The social sciences are looking for new direction. We've talked to dozens of social scientists who are excited about the possibility of looking at the data that's being left behind by scientists and start to create new models. And designers that are interested in being a part of this, and artists that are interested in being a part of it. So I think we're just at a very special moment, and I think that's part of it, is that we are on the cusp, as I said earlier, and this is my last point. I think we're on the cusp of this 21st century scientific renaissance, and if something as all-consuming as that impacts academia, well then academia will be not only following that trend, but leading it as well.
Before Lee closes the session, I'd like to make clear that Microsoft is not one of the unnamed companies preventing us.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in
Microsoft is not one of the unnamed companies.
Please join me in thanking Adam very much for a fascinating talk. Thank you. And I'll also say again, congratulations to Phil on the Jim Gray Award. Thank you all. Have a fantastic evening.